The caves of Hoxie's 4 are full of all kinds of fauna, and previously we looked at the glyphids, the most populous of the hostile organisms in this planet's history. However, at the current moment, the glyphids are only one of the 3 primary hostile clades of organisms that plague the dwarves in their mining expeditions on Hoxie's. The other 2 are known as the Mactera and the Naedocytes, both species with a great amount of interspecies/intergenus variety, and so much so that they have warranted their own video. It's these exceedingly interesting organisms which we'll be looking at in this duo biological analysis of the Mactera and the Naedocytes in Deep Rock Galactic. As numerous as the glyphids are, many other species also share the environment with them, one of these species being the Mactera. Now, as far as we know, none of the glyphids can really fly, which makes sense after all. Aerial travel in species like these really would only be needed for long-scale traversal. However, if it wasn't bad enough that they already swarm every little terrestrial part of the caves, they also have an ally which flies everywhere in between. The Mactera are a genus of aerial insectoid life forms, which has a variety of different species within it. I call this a genus and each of the unit species because in this context, it is what I would believe to make the most sense, with no indications that the Mactera are a social species with castes other than the fact that they simply just don't kill each other. It's entirely possible that these members of the same genus are simply okay with tolerating each other's presence, as that may increase individual survivability. All of the members evolved wings similar to that of an earth dragonfly, with small wings that sustain their body weight by flapping at extremely high speeds. With this, they also have a kind of developed symbiotic relationship with the glyphids, something that will become very common from here on out, as siding with the apex predators of your planet probably yields a safer result than not. The Mactera are often seen fighting right alongside the glyphids, ideally helping to attack from angles that the glyphids cannot reach, which in turn the glyphids will likely allow them to have a share of any food they come across. This is also helped along by the Mactera's other genus-wide adaptation, an ability similar to a spider's where they can liquefy the insides of a carcass, then suck it out with some kind of proboscis, said to be the length of an old world cavalry saber. This likely significantly helps with their relationship with the glyphids, as to get a good meal they don't even have to consume an entire carcass, only needing to consume the insides and leaving the rest to the glyphids, if they even eat those carcasses at all. This has also led them to becoming a major pest to the dwarves of Deep Rock Galactic, as they have all this efficiency while also being lightning fast and super high in population due to that relationship with the glyphids. The most common of the Mactera species is that which we will be discussing first, which is known as the Mactera spawn. As opposed to what its name suggests, I do not believe that the Mactera spawn is actually a baby or a spawn of its species, as to me that just seems implausible, with it being fully armored and such. Instead, I do believe that this is a mature adult of the species which has gone on to help the glyphids in order to get its share of food. We see that it's pretty much completely blind, with 4 large mandibles and 2 smaller ones. The large ones would obviously be used for grasping food, and the 2 smaller ones might be used to make an opening in any carcasses that the Mactera spawn comes across in order to insert the proboscis for feeding. Away from its mouth, it has 4 wings, which share a close resemblance with those wings of a dragonfly. This also likely means that the Mactera's flight mechanism would be considered direct flight. See, most insects, when they fly, they use a system called indirect flight, wherein they flap their wings by using muscles to kind of deform their abdomen, which in turn causes the wings to flap, which is all fine and good, but dragonflies actually do it differently. Instead, they use a system called direct flight, where they have actual muscles attached to the wings, which they can control without the flexing of their body parts. This is part of the reason why whenever you see one, they look super stable. Deep Rock's Mactera works in a very similar way, where it can keep itself very stable while initiating its other primary function. The Mactera spawn will primarily attack with a spine covered in some corrosive substance within their lower abdomen. It's likely that they develop these spines over time within their bodies. However, I'm not too sure on the specifics of how they would do such a thing, as there aren't many real-world parallels to this system. I hypothesize that it essentially works similar to the way a porcupine or any quilled animal's quills may grow, a structure which grows like keratin, similar to our fingernails, but instead, in the Mactera, it occurs as an internal process, with spines being grown within the body and coated with what may also function as its digestive fluid, before being shot out if the Mactera is threatened or hunting with the glyphids. Now, the Mactera genus as a whole almost always has two pairs of limbs, the use of which, in the Mactera spawn at least, is up for debate. As far as I'm aware, we never really see any species of Mactera walk on the ground in any way, nor do their legs look well adapted for stable locomotion on the ground. My hypothesis is that the reason their legs look so spiky like this is so that they can instead secure themselves to the ground while feeding, with their arms allowing them to secure any prey. However, this theory is in part thrown off by the fact that the miner's manual seems to imply that it primarily feeds on carcasses and dead bodies, obviously. Regardless, the Mactera spawn remains an interesting being amongst the constant swarms barraging the dwarves. However, its cousins have it beat in terms of survivability. The Mactera Brundle is an evolved individual of the Mactera genus, which at one point in its history developed armor to protect itself from any threats. This armor grew all over its body, and in particular, its weak point at its stomach. This armor is quite heavy, and thus over time it also evolved to have much stronger wings, with a wider wing shape. These adaptations are obviously to combat predation, and on top of that, it is also to combat prey retaliation, as this Mactera variant is said to be much more aggressive and unafraid to close the distance between itself and its adversary. Even so, it looks almost exactly the same as the spawn, with no major development happening anywhere other than the main body armor. I speculate that this individual actually evolved from a hypothetical proto-armored Mactera, which itself, as a result of a population split, became two species, the Brundle as we know it, and our next species, the Trijaw. The Mactera Trijaw is an interesting Mactera species, being more akin to a volcano with wings than it is an alien bug. It's not often that species should require more than two jaws, with leeches really being the only exception on Earth. However, I don't believe that these are real jaws. Instead, I believe they are significantly evolved mandibles, one similar to the four mandibles seen on the Mactera spawn. As I said earlier, the ability to have developed these jaws likely comes from a proto-armored Mactera, which developed hardened skin in general, where it then split into two populations. The population that eventually became Brundles likely faced selective pressures such as overhunting and a harsher environment. However, the population that became the Trijaw likely faced things such as a lack of suitable prey and significant prey retaliation. The Trijaw developed armor primarily on its face, limbs, and back to protect it from the many retaliations of whatever prey and maybe some predators that lie within the caves of Hoxie's. Very interestingly, the three plates of armor on its face are organized in a particular way where it's like a tube, like the barrel of a gun. It then uses these to fire 3 spines, as opposed to the previous unit's 1, in short bursts. I find this very interesting as it essentially shows what one would presume to be a defensive adaptation being creatively used as an offensive adaptation by allowing it to more accurately pinpoint where its spines will land. It seems that as a result of the higher number of spines shot per burst, its abdomen has expanded to accommodate room for the increased spines, and also probably has a more acidic fluid, a slight morphological change which nonetheless is important to note. Our next unit, however, has a lot more than just slight morphological changes. The Mactera Grabber is probably the most annoying bug in this game, and don't get me wrong, I hate it too, but it's definitely the most interesting of the Mactera genus. Its limbs are much longer, and it has even developed a third pair in order to fill out a completely separate niche from what its predecessor was originally a part of. See, the Mactera Grabber is essentially an example of convergent evolution with many Earth species of birds. Essentially, it's evolved to pick up prey and then drop it, killing it from the blow. This is a remarkable way that intelligent species can save on the use of energy needed to kill a prey themselves. instead allowing forces like gravity to do the work. It's likely that, in a particularly suitable environment, an isolated population of the common ancestor to all of the Mactera genus likely found that it could engage in this behavior and passed it on to its descendants. Then this behavior influenced the morphological changes that we see in the grabber today. Individuals with extra or longer limbs outperformed specimens whose limbs were less suited for this niche. This has also led to the development of eyes, something which none of the Mactera we've seen thus far have possessed. These eyes were most likely needed to better pinpoint the location of a potential prey item on the ground from an above perspective. Additionally, its stomach has shrunk significantly, only needing to accommodate food and not any spines. This has made it lose its ability to intentionally attack anything without relying on gravity to do the work, something which in the wild is a huge saving of resources, but against the dwarves, of course, leads to its downfall. Another odd thing I noticed about the grabber is its armor, which looks distinctively different from the rest of the Mactera genus. It seems to have a great amount of spikes along the length of its limbs. I believe these, partially being convergent with many Earth arthropods, are there to have a better grip on any potential prey, with individuals whose armor developed in this way outcompeting the rest. Now again, I would like to bring attention to the grabber's eyes, as while they are an interesting adaptation, they also help us with discerning their relation to our next and final Mactera species. The Mactera Goo Bomber is the obese final individual species of the Mactera genus. I believe it has evolved its specialized stomach acids to become even more corrosive and adhesive in nature, but notice that the Goo Bomber in particular looks odd, nothing like the Spawn, Brundle, or Trijaw. However, it does bear a striking resemblance to the grabber. Yes, although this is far-fetched, I believe that the Goo Bomber descends from an isolated population of grabbers who evolved to have their stomach acid become more potent, which in turn led to a behavioral shift, once again primarily using its stomach contents to subdue prey. In a way, it essentially left the niche that the original Mactera was a part of in the form of the grabber before then reconverging with that niche in a whole new way. In reality, this is probably super unlikely to have really happened, but there are some features which can lead to this much more interesting conclusion. For one, the Goo Bomber's posture is just unlike any of the other Mactera species except for the grabber, with it being kind of hunched instead of straight like the Spawn. Additionally, it has eyes, which at first I thought helped it with utilizing its goo attacks, which it may still do. However, we have precedent from the other Mactera species that eyes are not necessary for firing projectiles in this genus, which may very well mean that, although they may help, the eyes are actually a remnant left behind from the descendant of the Goo Bomber and the grabber. The Goo Bomber is much larger than most of its brethren, with, again, the only Mactera species getting close to its size being the grabber. And so while it may be significantly unlikely, it also remains a very interesting possibility. The Goo Bomber also has a minor variant, which is more of a subspecies than anything, which has just adapted to a frigid environment with both camouflage and hunting strategy. The Frost Bomber, due to how cold it is, instead hunts prey with fast-freezing foam. According to the Miner's Manual, it's actually theorized that within this foam there is a large mass of microscopic larvae which solely thrive at these high temperatures, implying that the development of a symbiotic relationship within this subspecies of Mactera has occurred. The Mactera are the aerial pairing to go with the Glyphids, a species that likely wouldn't even be able to exist to the capacity that it does today without the Glyphid support. As we can see here, I've devised a rich evolutionary history for these guys, as the variation within their genus implies, and it's very likely that along the way, the Glyphids were alongside them influencing their evolution over the years. Our next species is similar in this way, as they too have allied with the Glyphids. However, one look at them will tell you that this is more likely to have to do with the fact that they aren't exactly palatable. The Naedocytes are probably one of the most alien-looking species on Hoxie's. They are a race of invertebrate, jellyfish-like organisms which all possess the ability to float, presumably through some kind of gas contained within them. There's a reason these individuals have the word cyte in their name, as their life cycle and really their very existence is akin to that of a single-celled or multicellular microorganism. All of this starts with the first form of the Naedocyte species, the hatchling. The common Naedocyte begins its life as a humble hatchling, born into the harsh caves of Hoxie's 4. It contains several defense mechanisms which help it defend itself against the wildlife. Its main body is of a spherical shape, with 4 groupings of connective tissue extending from the center and supporting 4 plates of chitin-like armor, which each have 4 spikes made out of a similar, possibly more hardened material. The hatchling, and the Naedocyte species as a whole, is able to fly using a system currently unknown to me, although it's likely that they are made of a very lightweight material and filled with a gas lighter than the air in the environment. This would essentially be a trade-off where agility, and evidently numbers, are put in favor of toughness. Naedocyte eggs are likely laid in significantly high volumes, which in turn ensure that at least some make it to adulthood. Alongside agility, the Naedocyte hatchling is very capable of defending itself. Those spikes, alongside a pseudo-mouth structure, are used heavily for the killing of any threats to itself or its mother. It has this mouth, however, it's solely for the purpose of attack, as the Naedocyte race as a whole doesn't actually feed on physical food. Instead, they are said to feed on static electricity. Yes, according to the Miner's Manual, it would seem that the ambient static charge, which all matter possesses, is the primary food source for the Naedocyte species. I'm not entirely sure how exactly this is, but if I were to give my little hypothesis, it may be that each Naedocyte possesses an organ which has some mechanism that takes in static electricity from the surroundings. Within this, there are cells or organelles made up from or descended from exoelectrogenic bacteria, or otherwise cells that are electrolithoautotrophs. These are defined as bacteria that directly consume and excrete electrons at different energy potentials without requiring the metabolization of any sugars or other nutrients, and organisms that use electricity to convert carbon dioxide into organic matter by using electrons directly taken from solid inorganic electron donors. This is a very complicated and kind of niche concept, and I'm not exactly sure how it works. I would hypothesize that maybe hundreds of millions of years ago, an organism, the predecessor to the current Naedocyte species, would have mutated a mechanism which collected static electricity and, by chance, consumed another cell, but instead of eating that cell, they simply became one in a form of endosymbiosis, similar to how the mitochondria became a thing on Earth. Regardless, it is static electricity garnered from the environment that allows the Naedocyte hatchling to reach maturity, and speaking of, for hatchlings that make it to a higher level of maturity, I believe that they grow into our next organism. The Cave Cruiser is what to me is a juvenile Naedocyte individual, essentially being the Naedocyte equivalent of a nymph, although in this case it doesn't share that much of a resemblance with the adult form. The Cave Cruiser is one of the few species here which are actually docile to the dwarves and, by extension, likely any perceived abnormalities in their territory. The Cave Cruiser's form is adapted to a life of, as its name suggests, cruising through the caves of Hoxie's. In the middle of the Naedocyte lifespan, it's likely that it changes survival tactics from defend itself at all costs to avoid everything at all costs. The Cave Cruiser essentially says, I ignore you and you ignore me. The only real threat to the Cave Cruiser would obviously be the Glyphids, who likely wouldn't even try to eat one unless they were starving, as none of them are aerial, and so it would require a Glyphid to either sacrifice itself, a ranged Glyphid to waste energy, or a Cave Cruiser to wander particularly close to a surface. I'm sure this happens quite often due to their sheer volume of Cave Cruisers, but again, due to those sheer numbers, many Cave Cruisers are almost guaranteed to make it to adulthood. One interesting thing about the Cave Cruisers is that they are solely found in the subterranean biome known as the Dense Biozone, a biome known for its abundant plant life. The reason for this is most likely due to how non-hostile this place would likely be for them. While from the dwarves' perspective, everything on the whole planet wants to murder them, it's likely that the dense biozone is an area subject to a very small amount of mobile predators, instead being replaced by an abundance of carnivorous plants, who themselves keep the rest of the non-predator populations in check. For anything that's not a dwarf and not considered good enough meal for a carnivorous plant, the dense biozone would be a sanctuary. Now, morphologically, the cave cruiser has developed many interesting features. The circular body that the hatchling once had has pretty much been encased entirely in a more standard kind of body, with the top half being made of soft but firm tissues, firm enough for any kind of dwarf to land on top of one steadily, and the bottom half sees an array of 7 tentacles, as well as a downward protrusion which has developed from the pseudo-mouth that the hatchling once had. This will soon become the centerpiece of the fully mature Naedocyte, which is also the Naedocyte which starts the cycle all over again. The Naedocyte Breeder is the final and most mature form of the Naedocyte. I would go as far as to call it a true adult Naedocyte, with all the other forms being specialized juvenile forms to fit certain purposes. The Breeder is the most complex Naedocyte form. Its central circular body has been extended into a long form, with the frontmost part having a variety of chitinous growths and the back half seemingly being an egg sac. Yes, the Naedocyte Breeder, as its name suggests, will lay many eggs, which themselves hatch into the earlier Naedocyte Hatchling. Notably, the Naedocyte Breeder is actually said to be mentally connected to the entire Naedocyte collective within its effective range. The front half of the Naedocyte Breeder, I would think, is actually a kind of brain case, which explains the many growths in an attempt to defend its brain. And being mentally linked to the collective isn't the only thing that this brain is used for, as the manual also claims that the Naedocyte Breeder travels great distances not only to lay eggs, but to also return to the clutches that it's laid, seemingly to check on their safety, a surprisingly emotive act from an exceptionally alien organism. But we should also consider how the breeder lays eggs in the first place. See, it's likely that under earthly classification, the Naedocyte would be known as a simultaneous hermaphrodite, similar to Earth species like snails, land slugs, earthworms, and a few kinds of fish. I believe that the Naedocyte breeder contains both sex organ analogs necessary for the fertilization of all these eggs. The purpose of these eggs is quite unknown to me, as live birth, while more energy intensive, would seem like the obvious option here, as eggs hatch within seconds of being laid. My thought is that it could be a kind of distraction system for predation, where eggs are laid and distract predators from the mother. Then, of course, those eggs hatch a lot faster than the predators can eat them, and the hatchlings go in and swarm the predators, allowing the mother to survive and continue producing offspring. Additionally, eggs actually hatch into 2 to 3 hatchlings each, which is likely to be an adaptation related to this very strategy. The hatchlings aren't the only things used for the defense of the breeder though, as there is another Naedocyte which doesn't quite fit into the cycle I've described thus far. The Naedocyte Shocker shares a distinct resemblance to the hatchling, however, it has some key morphological differences which I believe separate it entirely from the Naedocyte life cycle. I've seen it speculated that the Shocker is an intermediary stage between the hatchling and the cave cruiser, however, I think it would be a significant waste of energy to develop 3 entirely distinct forms, one of which already having an energy-intensive ability before even reaching maturity. Instead, the more plausible option, and one partially supported by the Miner's Manual calling the Shocker a soldier, is that the Shocker is a version of the hatchling born when the mother feels threatened or exposed. While we never really see any Shockers actually hatching out of the eggs, it's possible that the breeder births them so that it may have a kind of escort as it travels through the caves. Additionally, it's possible that, due to their ability to create so much more of an electric charge than its contemporaries, the Shocker may actually serve as a food source of sorts, constantly generating electricity that the breeder can feed on. What happens to these Shockers after they reach maturity, though, remains a mystery to me. The hatchling, and by extension the cave cruiser, share a significant resemblance to the breeder, but the Shocker doesn't, with it being far more pink and lacking the distinct spikes its brethren possesses. This leads me to 3 possible conclusions. The first, and most likely, being that it just dies, being a caste of the Naedocytes which solely serves the purpose of defending and feeding the breeder until death. The second option is that it may eventually shed off the extra features with a molt when it's time for it to mature into a cave cruiser, although this would require an excess of energy. The third would reconstruct the entirety of the Naedocyte life cycle I've built up so far, but I'll explain it anyway. Essentially, it may be possible that the Naedocyte Breeder is in fact not a simultaneous hermaphrodite and instead being gonachoric. In this version of the life cycle, the hatchling would grow directly into the breeder and the shocker directly into the cave cruiser, which would be the male half. The primary reason why I find this implausible is due to the significant use of energy and the shocker's lack of resemblance to the cave cruiser. However, it is supported in part by the fact that the shockers are relegated to spawning in only two biomes, the glacial strata and the dense biozone, the latter of which is solely where the cave cruisers are found. Regardless, you guys should let me know which version you guys think would be more plausible in the comments below. And so that brings me to the end of this video. These two clades of organisms are amongst the most interesting seen in Deep Rock Galactic as a whole, so much so that it was warranted that they got their own video, separated from what's to come, because, to be honest, the future organisms to be presented aren't exactly as developed in the lore as the main three ones have been. In the next video, I'll cover those ones, and the pathogens seen on Hoxie's 4 to complete the full analysis of Deep Rock Galactic. With that being said, as always, I hope this video has encouraged you to look at the games you play under a more detailed lens, and if you ever find something that you may find interesting, you can leave a comment below letting me know about it. If you'd like the opportunity to know when I'd be uploading said video, or if you just want to support me in general, you can subscribe to my Patreon. In doing so, you'll get a video roadmap for all future videos that I may upload. If you want to support me in a way that does not involve a subscription though, you can also leave a thanks in the comments below. However, you will be missing out on certain perks like early access and a shout out at the end of my videos. And with all that being said, thanks for watching, and goodbye.